It's July. It's finally here. The biggest race in women's cycling, the Giro Donne. And I'm here with Amy Jones to talk through it all and get some stories from last year's race too. We're starting on Friday, Amy. Who's going to win? Let's go straight in there.
Who's going to win the overall? Or
who's going to win the overall?
It's really hard to look past Anna van der Breggen, to be honest. Depending, actually, if they decide to defend her title or if they're going to ride for Demi Vollering, which has been happening recently. I just think, though, maybe climbing-wise, van der Breggen's got the edge there. And she's going to be in, well, they're all going to be in ridiculous form ahead of the Olympics. But aside from van der Breggen, I would keep an eye on Elisa Longo Borghini. It's a race that she would love to win. It's a home race for her, being Italian, and in the national champions jersey. And she's back with Lizzie Deignan for their two-pronged attack situation they've got going on over there. Yeah, one of those two, I would say.
Yeah, it seems like it's been really Elisa's year so far. And you also have the prospect, like with the race opening team time trial, it's quite long. I think it's 27K. They have a strong team. They're really very strong. Probably the closest to SD Works in terms of quality. They're bringing Ruth Winder, Ellen van Dijk. They're going to be up there, if not beating SD Works in TTT. And those first 2 days are going to be crucial. You've got a TTT, then a mountaintop finish on Prati Nervoso. It's like 15K at 7%. That's just, that's like going from 0 to 100 in 3 seconds. The other thing I was wondering about in terms of contenders is a bit of an intriguing unknown one. It's Demi Vollering. Last time she did the Giro was 2 years ago. She wasn't really the racer that she is now. She's really had a breakthrough year. Can she contend for GC? Can she even be up there in 5th on the podium near van der Breggen?
Yeah, I mean, it's a race with a lot of variation in it as well, which she is an all-rounder. I mean, so is van der Breggen, but Vollering's got an edge when it comes to fast finishes too. So she could still be up there winning bonus seconds on days where it comes down to a reduced bunch sprint. I mean, I'm not sure I can see her beating the likes of, say, Lorena Wiebes or Emma Norsgaard in a pure sprint. But, she's got the all-terrain ability, and their SD Works they have a lot of cards to play. They have a really strong team. I guess crucially, last time Vollering was racing here, she didn't have the same team and the same backup that she's got now. And if they decide to race for her, then, what better domestique than the world champion?
Absolutely. It's probably worth mentioning, maybe Vollering is too, who's aiming to peak for the Olympics. And in fact, we're seeing a few big name absentees, Annemiek van Vleuten and Kasia Niewiadoma, who I think were both on the podium last year. Certainly Niewiadoma was.
Van Vleuten crashed out on stage 7. She was leading the race, and then she crashed out. So yeah, who knows what would have happened there, but well, she probably would have taken it. But yeah, interesting that they've opted not to race. It's one of those where it's kind of an experiment. When we get to the Olympics, we'll see which one paid off, like actually having the racing in their legs or having, I guess, altitude training or wherever they're going. But in the case of Niewiadoma, it leaves a really interesting gap in Canyon SRAM for Michaela Harvey. She's 22 years old. She came 5th overall last year and won the Young Riders jersey. So I'm really interested to see how she goes if she's their leader, which I'm sure she will be.
And that sets me up for a perfect shameless plug of this issue of Rouleur, which has a long interview with Michaela Harvey, who's come a very long way, like geographically from Auckland, but also figuratively to, take that Young Riders jersey last year. Really a kind of fascinating few seasons going from nobody to their leader for this race, basically. And then let's move on to the evergreen Marianne Vos, who won 3 stages last year. She's always up there, certainly on the kind of the punchier finishes. She's almost unbeatable. And she could be in the top 10 overall.
She's almost unbeatable, yet she was beaten in La Course by not just Demi Vollering, but also Cecilia Ludwig. So I think what's interesting there is the team dynamics at play, because while Jumbo-Visma are a great team, they've got some really talented riders individually, they don't have the same firepower as the likes of SD Works and Trek. So when it comes to a finish like that, like we saw in La Course, Vos finds herself isolated and she has to lead out any sprints, which she's gotten away with before, but now that other teams are so much stronger, it's not paying off as often as she'd probably like. But I would expect to see her add to her, I think it's 28 Giro Rosa stage victories that she's got. I'd be surprised if she doesn't add one more to that this time.
We should talk about, not surprise packages, but some names who could have big Giros under the radar. I'm thinking Katarina Allerud, the Movistar rider, who in the absence of Van Vleuten, I've really noticed her in the hilly kind of classics and the hilly stage races doing quite well. This is a massive opportunity to push for the leadership of the team, maybe in a few years' time, because Van Vleuten's not going to be around forever.
Are you sure about that?
Prove me wrong, enemy. Prove me wrong.
No, yeah, Allerud, I had her down as well. I mean, she, on paper, you would have said maybe at the beginning of the season that Leah Thomas would have been the natural second best to Annemiek, I guess. But she's been really impressive this season. Allerud, I think she had a top 10 in Burgos overall, and she finished quite high on that really steep climb on the final stage. So yeah, she's definitely one to watch in the absence of Van Vleuten. Another one to look out for, perhaps not for the overall as much as some stages maybe, is Maria Novolovskaya. She rides for AR Monex, so not the biggest team, it's a continental team. But last year she came really close to a stage win, and unfortunately crashed in the last kilometer, but she was also attacking throughout the race. Like every stage she was on the move. And yeah, she's definitely one to look out for. Did you have anyone else?
There's just a few I'm interested in seeing how they go, like obviously Kristen Faulkner, who's in her first year of World Tour racing. She's really impressed, not just on the bike, but off the bike with her thinking and her ideas for the future of women's cycling. She comes from a big business background. I want to see how she copes for the 10 days. You know, can she be up there top 10 in GC? Could she win a stage? Will she be on the attack? Hopefully all those things. Also, like we talk about Norsgaard and Lorena Vibes as the sprinters to beat, I think they haven't won a Giro stage ever before. So it would still be a nice thing in their palmarès to have. And that will be a nice battle, hopefully. There's not really any, there's a few sprint stages, but really only stage 5, you'd say, is a first nailed on one, very flat one around Milan.
Yeah, it's pretty rare actually for like pure sprint stages in this race. Marianne Vos won the points jersey last year, which she's not necessarily a sprinter. She's just like a punchy rider with a fast finish. So now that there's actually pure sprinters there to contest that, that'd be pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think it's the other person worth mentioning is Amanda Spratt, who isn't a small name, wouldn't be a surprise, but she's not had an amazing season. She's flying a bit under the radar somehow. Like Grace Brown's, her compatriot, her teammate, had a real kind of breakthrough spring. Spratt was on the podium, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. There's no reason why she can't repeat that. When Van Vleuten left, that left a power vacuum in the team. She's not really seized it yet, to be honest, and she needs a good Giro, frankly.
Yeah, she does, especially ahead of the Olympics. I mean, for that team, for Bike Exchange, I would have said Grace Brown, but yeah, you never know what kind of form Spratt could pull out of the bag for this race. You know, the proximity to the Olympics, she might have just been working her way up. As we've seen also with Van Vleuten, she hasn't been on the same form that we've come to know from her in previous seasons. So yeah, maybe Sprat's got some cards close to her chest that she's going to play at this race.
Let's see. We won't see that much of it, will we, Amy? Because I gather there's only going to be, is it 15 kilometers worth of live action every day, which is still an improvement from last year, but that's like improving on 0 is pretty easy.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a classic kind of push and pull of women's cycling, is like, should we just be grateful that we were given this crumb of live coverage and it's better than nothing, or really is it almost just worse in a way to just have this like tiny piece of the action of the race and just be thinking, what have we missed? Because it's going to be so good. And they've gone so far, they've done this amazing route that's really varied, they've obviously put a lot of thought into the parkour, into all these other things, and then to only show the last 15 kilometers, which that will be if we're lucky, because depending on how they work it out, we might end up seeing less, because what happened, or what's tended to happen with that sort of situation, is that the women race faster than expected, and then by the time they turn on the cameras, they're actually at 10k to go or less than that. So yeah.
Well, I mean, this is the thing, like, how do you measure it? Like, for example, you have 2 summit finishes, stage 2 to Prata Nervosa and stage 9 to Monte Matallur. You can't show 15k of that. You can't even barely even show the last 5k of these steep climbs. There's not enough time. I still wouldn't really go off on one about this before recording, but just imagine just seeing the last 15k or even a random 15k that you wouldn't even know about, of the Tour de France, of Paris-Roubaix, of Tour of Flanders. Like, this is the biggest race in women's cycling with a long and decorated history. It's a joke. It's an absolute joke. It's still better than it was, but that doesn't make it much less of a joke. You see what I mean? Like, and if people don't say this and they just accept it, things don't change, do they?
No, exactly. I mean, even La Course, for all the flack that race got for being a token race or whatever, there was live coverage of the entire race from start to finish, and you see all of the action from the beginning. Like, it's constant attacks. Like, you see the work that gets put in by domestiques that usually just don't even get a look in when they only show the final few kilometers. And yeah, it's just kind of, stage racing is all about the narrative of, the battle for the GC, and people go on the attack, and it's like you're willing them on, and you just don't get that if you can only see the last 15Ks of each stage. You don't see the full picture, and that's what stage racing is about, really.
Yeah. So thanks, but no thanks for the crumbs. Hopefully it'll keep improving in the future. That's the only thing we can kind of hope for and push for. As for the route, which stages do you think will be decisive, and which ones are you looking forward to the most?
The first couple of stages are actually going to be, I think they'll set the scene for the rest of the race. The TTT, that's been a fixture of this race now for a few years. And Trek won it last year. I would expect them to win it again, which will put the other teams on the back foot. And Elisa Longo Borghini will probably have a nice little lead there going into the second stage, which finishes on a category 1 climb, which is going to be really interesting, really exciting. So I think things are going to get shaken up really early on. Other than that, the mountain time trial on stage 4, if someone's not got good legs that day, they could end up losing loads of time. And I'm actually looking forward to seeing the sprinters get a chance in this race, as we mentioned before.
if they can keep it all together, this is the other thing that, you know, sometimes we have these days where a strong rouleur or a big composition of riders who are, you know, over 10 minutes down, 15 minutes down on GC get away and you get some epic wins. I think I remember Tiff Cromwell did a solo break several years ago at the Giro, about 120k and won. So I'd like to see a bit of that as well, and not just bunch sprint action.
Interesting that you mentioned Tiff Cromwell, actually, because that was a few years ago, and she looks a lot like the rider that she looked like a few years ago now, after a few seasons where, you know, she's not really had the same form. She's looking really good. She did a phenomenal attack at the bottom of the last climb in La Course. So yeah, excited to see what she does.
And of course, you know, the Giro we're talking about is the big race that no one can see often, but you were there for the entirety of it last year, Amy. And racing at the Women's Giro is always eventful and dramatic. And sometimes not just the racing. How was the experience for you?
It was interesting. Obviously, the thing is when you go to a bike race, you don't really get to see much bike racing, because obviously you can only be in a few places. But the thing that stood out was that, yeah, of course, the racing was really dramatic, really, like, as women's racing always is, just really exciting. What kept us on our toes even more, though, was the organizers kind of, what's the word? They like to change things up last minute. There were, I think, 2 stages where they changed the route on the day. Team Sunweb were late for the start of one of the stages because they didn't get a communique before the race about the fact that the start time had changed, which I think was on the day or the night before, very late on. And, you know, some of that was to do with a collapsed bridge that was outside of their control. But yeah, it was interesting as well because of COVID. Things were a bit difficult, talking to riders, as everybody knows from like other races. And what really doesn't help when you're working at a race is when your car breaks down before a stage start and you need to drive to certain points on the course because you have a photographer.
And it's only a photographer. Yeah. We have to also shout out friend of Rouleur and Rouleur regular David Powell, who you were with.
Yes, the one and only. Who actually, if he wasn't with me, I think I would have just sat and sulked in the car the whole stage and just wouldn't know what to do. So yeah, we had to the electrics went on our rental car and we couldn't even lock it. So cue us like chucking all our belongings out of the car into someone else's car and going with them to the stage. So yeah, that was high drama. But
we're not going to go into the long running legal battle. And the fact that I think, if I'm not incorrect here, Amy, that it was a Fiat that broke down and you had to travel a long way to get a new car, at which point they gave you the same make of car that just failed on you.
Yeah, that was great. Like David on the phone was like, so you're going to give us an upgrade, right? And they were like, yeah. And we get there and they're like, all we've got is the same Fiat as you just had to deal with. And we were just like, at this point, fine, whatever. And that was my second car breakdown in a week because my own car broke down the week before. So
that is right.
I think I just need, yeah.
Curb Your Enthusiasm music should have been playing when they dropped the keys of the new car into your hand.
Yeah. Another highlight, the things you just don't see when, you know, because you don't see the Giro Rosa or the Giro Donne, is the start of, I can't remember which stage it was, but it was inside a shopping centre that was shaped like Vesuvius. So they literally started inside with all the shops, all the riders in this shopping centre. I mean, I think they were quite glad for the aircon. So yeah, that was a strange one. But I mean, yeah, different organisers. So maybe there won't be as much of this shenanigans going on this year.
Well, my local shopping centre when I was a teenager was really slippery floors. So I'm imagining there would have been chaos. You can barely stand up in like cleats there. But at least they could have gone shopping 10 minutes before the stage start, maybe. It's certainly different.
If you forgot, your knickers or something, go and get some from the shopping centre. But it was actually something out of I was expecting the tour series in the UK to start taking notes there, actually, of how can we make this more difficult? Yeah, let's go through a shopping centre. So you had to actually go through as well, because the sign-on was on the other side. So you had to actually go through the shopping centre to get to that and then back again. So yeah. Exactly.
I do love novel bike race starts. There was one Vuelta where they started on a massive naval vessel, like a warship. That's pretty cool. That beats your run-of-the-mill industrial town or estate. So bike race organisers, please keep up the arbitrary start locations. We love it. Fans do too, especially if they can actually see it on TV though, or in person. Yeah.
Speaking of industrial estates, there is a stage that starts in Milan, which has endless, possibilities visually and in terms of starting the race in the center of a huge city. But it looks like that's also going to start on the outskirts in an industrial estate. So,
yeah, I was going to have a little rant about that as well. Just the fact that the longest, there's 10 stages, the longest women's race of that level. It doesn't have a finish in Milan. It doesn't, finish with prestige like the Tour does in Paris or the Vuelta in Madrid. The last stage is ending on a kind of Italian-Slovenian border town of 7,000 people. Is that a big deal? Maybe not, but it would be nice to have kind of a bit of ceremony, a bit of importance. Imagine the women's Giro ending up in Milan next to the Duomo, like the men's race often does. Maybe that's a nice extra compared to, bigger priorities like TV coverage and, like a higher minimum wage for all teams, that kind of thing. But something for 5 to 15 years time, maybe.
Yeah, well, I mean, the Tour de France Femme next year is going to start on the Champs-Elysees on the same day that the men's race finishes there. So the symbolism is important there, I think. And yeah, the Tour de France, the women's Tour de France Femme, is going to take place in the same month in July as the Giro next year. So it's going to be really interesting to see if riders choose to race both of those races. Especially if the Giro doesn't step up with live coverage. They're supposed to be trying to get their World Tour status back for next year. Because I don't know if we mentioned this earlier, it's important to note that they were stripped of their Women's World Tour race status because last year they failed to provide any live coverage at all, which is actually mandatory for Women's World Tour races. They have to have at least 45 minutes. So they're trying to get that back next year. Will 15Ks do it? No, but if they can provide that for next year's race, then they should be okay. So given especially how La Course had start to finish live, maybe we can't expect that from every stage of the Tour de France Femme, but we can expect more than the bare minimum from that. And I think when that's often cited as the most important factor for the growth of women's cycling, you can expect teams and you can expect the big riders to go to that. If it's a choice between the two, they'll go to that race, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, lots to be done. I feel like we've put the women's cycling world to rights a little bit over the last 25 minutes, but it really bears saying, watch the Giro Donne. It's going to be cracking racing. Even if we don't see much of it, it'll still be absolutely worthwhile. And join us soon for another debrief, probably at the end of the women's Giro, actually, in 2 weeks' time. So until then, goodbye.